The most basic structural unit of biblical Hebrew poetry, like we find in the book of Psalms, is the parallelistic couplet or bicolon, which I introduced in a different video. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the poetic structures that the biblical poets used to bind these bicola, along with the less common monocola and tricola, into larger poetic units. Let's start with refrains, because they're very easy to understand and to recognize. A refrain in a biblical psalm is sort of like a chorus in a modern song, a line or set of lines repeated at least twice that divides the psalm into smaller sections. For a good example, pause the video right here and read Psalm 57. Did you notice that Psalm 57:5 and Psalm 57:11, or 57:6 and 57:12 if you're reading a Hebrew Bible, quite often Hebrew verse numbers are one number off because of the way that English Bibles are translated. Actually, it's the English Bibles that are off, but that's not important right now. Through the rest of the video, I'll use English verse numberings, since that's what most viewers will be using. Did you notice that Psalm 57:5 and 57:11 are identical? Those verses also divide the psalm into two basically equal parts. In the first part, the psalmist describes a sense of distress, and then comes the refrain. After the refrain, the psalmist describes the resolution of his distress, and then repeats the refrain to cap off the psalm. Psalm refrains, by the way, don't have to be identical verbal repetitions. Just like modern songwriters can change a few words in subsequent iterations of their choruses, so biblical psalmists can vary their refrains a bit and still provide a large-scale structure to their psalms. Read Psalm 56 to see an example where a psalmist very clearly uses a refrain but doesn't repeat exactly the same words in both instances of that refrain. Now, sometimes biblical poets will use a device called inclusion, or inclusio in Latin. Some readers prefer to use the term envelope structure instead. An inclusion, or envelope, is formed by repeating near identical words, or at least very similar ideas, at the beginning and end of a poetic unit. Some biblical psalmists like to bracket entire psalms with inclusions or envelopes. For example, Psalm 8 begins and ends with the famous words, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." But inclusions or envelopes can surround smaller parts of a psalm as well. Pause this video for a moment and read Psalm 128, looking for an envelope within the psalm. Did you notice the envelope structure that sets off Psalm 128, 1 through 4 from verses 5 and 6? Verse 1 reads, "Happy is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways," while verse 4 repeats this sentiment, "Thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord." Inside the envelope, verses 2 and 3 describe the type of blessing the psalmist envisions, while outside the envelope, verses 5 and 6 offer a prayer on behalf of the audience. Now, another famous structuring device in the Psalms is called chiasm, after the Greek letter chi, which is shaped like a Roman letter X. You can think of a chiasm as a series of nested inclusions or envelopes building toward a central point. Chiasms sometimes operate on a very small level with close verbal correspondences, as when the two cola in a parallelistic couplet exhibit inverse grammatical sequences. But be careful when trying to identify these micro-chiasms in translation, as the translation might not reflect the underlying Hebrew sentence structure. Both the New International Version and the New Revised Standard Version, for example, exhibit a small chiasm in Psalm 1:2, which reads in the NRSV, "Their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night." Well, the NIV is almost identical, although it uses singular pronouns. This looks like a tiny chiasm, with the word order verb object in colon 1 and the word order object verb in colon 2. And in fact, this illustrates the idea of a micro-level grammatical chiasm very, very nicely. In fact, however, Both NRSV and NIV have inverted the word order in the Hebrew of verse 2a, where no chiasm is actually evident. So don't hang too much on the micro chiasms that you might perceive in an English translation. Of more interest, but harder to discern, are large-scale thematic chiasms, where the corresponding parts might be verbally linked by only a few words. Take a quick look at Psalm 52, 2 through 4 in an English translation. You might perceive a sort of chiasm here, unfolding in paired lines. Unit A, in verse 2, "Your tongue is like a sharp razor, you worker of treachery," corresponds to Unit A prime in verse 4, "You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue." These wrap around Unit B in verse 3, "You love evil more than good, and lying more than speaking the truth." Because identification of these chiasms depends as much on themes as on verbal repetition, it's a judgment call. But you might even perceive yet another layer of wrapping in which verses 1 to 2a contrast with verse 5. Now, chiasms can get quite complex, and the individual units within a chiasm can get a bit long. Pause the video for a moment so that you can read Psalm 49, and then we'll see whether we can discern a large-scale chiasm there. To see a chiasm in Psalm 49, you have to think about poetic units that run on for 3 to 5 verses. In verses 5 through 9, the psalmist encourages himself, at least I suspect it's a himself, not to fear wealthy persecutors, because their wealth will not save them from death. In verses 10 through 12, the psalmist likens the mortality of the wise and the mortality of the foolish. In verses 13 through 15, the psalmist contrasts the mortality of fools with his own hope in God. And finally, in verses 16 through 20, the psalmist encourages his audience not to fear wealthy persecutors because their wealth will not save them from death. Notice too how verses 12 and 20 contain a refrain, dividing this portion of the psalm into 2 parts. One part moving from "do not fear the wealthy" to "everybody dies," and the other part proceeding from "everybody dies" to "do not fear the wealthy." Thus, Psalm 49 does seem to exhibit a chiasm in verses 6 through 20, but the individual units of the chiasm are rather long, and one must look at themes, not just words, to identify the structure. Finally, let me mention that some psalms are acrostics, meaning that each line of the psalm starts with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Use of this structure reaches dizzying heights in Psalm 119, whose 22 stanzas each contain 8 lines starting with the same letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Acrostic psalms are virtually impossible to detect in translation, and scholars still debate the significance of this structure. But its use does show another way in which the biblical psalmists sought to produce poetry that was not just religiously significant, but also, at least in their eyes and ears, aesthetically pleasing.